Hello and welcome to India Speak, the podcast by the Center for Policy Research. 2 weeks before the US was set to complete its troop withdrawal from the region, the Taliban seized power in Afghanistan. Major cities fell in a matter of days as the Afghan military and government collapsed rapidly. I am Sushant Singh, Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research, and to discuss these developments, I have with me Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, former Ambassador to Afghanistan and Senior Visiting Fellow at CPR. So first off, my question is very simple. What is your sense about what is going on in Afghanistan? How did Taliban get the control of the whole country so quickly and so easily?
Sushant, okay. What is going on in Afghanistan? Actually, what we are getting is a very partial picture of what is going on. There is very little international media coverage. What we are seeing is very curated images being released by the Taliban themselves. And even what is coming out from independent media organizations like Tolo News right now seem to be quite sanitized. They are actually showing women presenters, even interviewing Taliban spokespersons. The Taliban leaders are nowhere to be seen as yet. And also, pictures and images of calm in the city. Even I saw a picture of a woman walking alone. But under the surface, we are getting reports which are mostly personal reports or WhatsApp type of reports of a fairly large-scale looting in parts of in rural Afghanistan. We know that in places like Spin Boldak, there were witch hunts conducted against government officials and security officers. The same kind of targeting of journalists, particularly those who work with foreign journalists, has taken place in Kandahar. In the north, we have very large numbers of internally displaced people who are coming. There have been reports of forced marriages. There have been reports of even women being killed for being, let's say, dressed immodestly. There is, a kind of medieval style army looting in certain places. So there have been some images of beating and being taken away. We don't know what offense they created. As they took over, there were images of people being hung, so summary justice being dispensed. So I would say that the only images that we saw from a major international television station, Al Jazeera, basically showed them at the presidential palace where they were hardly going to be at their worst behavior, and these were obviously some of their top military commanders. So I would say that we are getting a very partial picture. We need to wait a little. I think Afghanistan is in a state of shock, and we need to wait a little before we know the kind of the reality on the scene. And it's also quite possible that the Taliban, because right now they are seeking international legitimacy, if not recognition also, that they will at this point of time be at their best behavior. They will try to keep their commanders in control. But remember, this is not a military a disciplined army like most national armies are. So they are also making an effort to keep in at least an outward facade of statesmanship or magnanimity, proclaiming an amnesty and so on. But I think we really have to wait a little more to see what the true nature of 2.0 is. Remember that on the way to 2.0, the kind of atrocities that were committed, and if we include the forced marriages that are now being talked about, are almost comparable to what the ISIS did in Iraq and Syria in an earlier phase of terrorism. Sushant, I think your second question was on?
Why did the Taliban win so easily? How did they capture the whole country so quickly?
Right, so this is of course a little difficult to explain, but if you really analyze now, it could have been foreseen. Let me put it like this. For one thing, it was the Afghan National Army was never developed as a national army. It wasn't an army and a standard or a conventional national army, with well-developed infantry battalions, mobility, logistics, engineering, technical support, armor, artillery, very, very important, and air support, and all that sort of is a normal standard army. Actually, the Pakistanis have ensured, right from the beginning, utilizing the leverage that they had on the US on ground lines of communication to make sure that that Afghanistan would not have an army that was capable of putting up a kind of resistance or whole territory like a normal army would. Second, the US, for all their sort of claims of spending money on the Afghan ANDSF, really only developed counter-terrorism capacities, counter-terrorism special forces units. Technically, the Afghan army is shown on the rolls as 300 to 350,000. There are many problems with that, including sort of phantom rolls and so on. But the actual fighting force, all along, if you see it, was these special forces units who were basically trained to retake targets of terrorist attack when they were attacked. So they acquitted themselves admirably when there were terrorist attacks against urban targets. A couple of times when Kunduz was taken over or Ghazni was taken over, they were even able to take them back. But that was the limit of their capacity. They could do it one city at a time, but they simply could not defend the whole country. I think add to this is the total dependence and intentional total dependence on the part of the US. They set up a NATO standard army. A NATO standard army is very different from a South Asian army, let us say. Giustuzi, one of the scholars, had done a study on this where I think he described, he said that the difference in expenditure between a South Asian army and a NATO standard army, I forget the exact multiplication that he used, but it was either 6 or 10 or 15. In other words, 15 times more expensive to have one soldier in that army. The Americans simply did not create an army, and the Afghans did not have that kind of army to be able to support this thing. To add to this, as I said, technical dependence, but also the psychological dependence and psychological dependence on their American mentors. And I think, the sheer political mismanagement of the Ghani period, particularly after the contested and, very highly questionable election results of 2019, all these eroded the credibility of the government, firstly. Secondly, there was a hopeless mismanagement in terms of appointments, particularly in the Ministry of Defense. You had really non-military people in charge in many important posts. The system was quite hollow. And when they found Bismillah Khan, who knew how to fight an Afghan war the Afghan way, it was too late. And, by this time already talk of a transitional government had started. So word went out that there is no need to fight, a deal is about to come. So why would people kill themselves if a deal was about to be made? And, there are whispered rumors coming out of Afghanistan that instructions were given to a large number of governors to simply disappear, not to fight, to surrender. You had that very public spectacle of the Ghazni governor surrendering. But in many other places, the ANDSF units simply left and handed over the territory to the. So I would say a combination of things: psychological, technical, material, political, administrative, but most of all, I would say the structural weaknesses of the Afghan army, which the Americans knew about and which they did not push out of sensitivity for Pakistan. And also, of course, such an army would have cost much more.
But Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, the structure of the army and the resources of the army being one, and also the fact that even the warlords did not fight. A lot of people expected the warlords to stand up and fight against the Taliban, but they simply seem to have vanished. They have not even surrendered. They have simply vanished. They are no longer to be seen. And related to the point that you made about the political part, where do you place Ashraf Ghani in this? He's right now the villain of the piece. Everybody is, mocking him, criticizing him, abusing him in that sense. But could he really have done something which could have or halted Taliban's advance, or stopped Taliban's advance, or changed the course of history, so to speak?
In retrospect, no. Because if you look at it, firstly, it doesn't only end at Ghani. if you look at the Americans, ever since they opened up channels to talk with the Taliban, that was in sometime around 2018, and then you had the US Taliban deal behind the backs of the Afghan government. Basically, the Afghan government was already being delegitimized. Ashraf Ghani was also totally discredited. His, his style of governance, his personality, he was very isolated. Everyone thought that the country was being run by a small clique from the palace. We, of course, supported it because he represented at that time the Islamic Republic. He was the elected president under the 2004 constitution. But the reality was that it was very, very hollow from inside. And since you've been in the army, that leadership is a very important factor. Morale is a very important factor. The ability to mobilize and inspire are very important factors in a fight. Even the warlords, the so-called warlords, the ethnic warlords of the north, Ghani had spent most of his term actually discrediting them, going out of his way actually to discredit them. Then only at the last minute, when it was far too late, when after the middle of almost at the end of April, when the Taliban launched their offensive, much after that, after the kind of offensive, the real offensive against the districts and the north and all that started, it was only then that Ghani went to the north and tried to effectively give license to the people who could fight to fight. And at the same time, there were these rumors going around of deals being done. You had Bismillah Khan tweeting, you had Atta and others who have tweeted some time back that, while they were being asked to fight on the one hand, they were getting mixed signals from the other hand to surrender. And behind this was also a very sophisticated psychological war operation, which I think was really masterminded in Pakistan. And Pakistan had been preparing for this right from the beginning. They were waiting for the day the US were to depart to be able to launch this offensive. On paper, you're talking about 60 to 70,000 Taliban, but I'm absolutely sure that the roles were filled with many other foreign fighters, particularly Pakistani fighters. And I'm sure there were Pakistani military advisors who were also advising the Taliban in their military strategy and tactics.
Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, that's pretty clear. Anybody who has seen the Taliban operate much earlier when they were ruling Afghanistan and has seen the level of command and control, the control over the narrative, the way they have behaved, the way they waited outside Kabul, clearly shows that there is some kind of centralized command and control. It's almost they're behaving better than most of the professional armies. Professional armies have people turning rogue and people doing all kinds of funny things. It's very surprising that a ragtag force, in a certain sense, which is not a disciplined army, which is fighting out of a certain amount of religious fervor, is actually displaying this level of discipline and this level of control, which clearly comes out of somebody who understands this and somebody who has been trained to handle this. So no, I totally agree with your point that most of the people are missing out. The Taliban's behavior is just not due to what Taliban is. It is being controlled, dictated, advised, commanded, guided by people probably who are well trained in military affairs, who are well trained in running military operations. That's something which people clearly seem to be missing out. Also, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, these images of the US military equipment falling into Taliban's hands, and these are major equipment, things like the Black Hawk helicopters, things like the armored tanks, the armored protective carriers, all kinds of stuff which is now in Taliban's hands. One is the visual aspect. The images, they don't look good if Taliban is running is sitting on a Black Hawk helicopter. But really, do the Taliban, with their friends like Pakistan that they have, or others, have the capacity to use this equipment? And could this equipment be used eventually even against some country like Pakistan if there's trouble between Taliban and Pakistan?
I would doubt if the Taliban are trained to actually use modern equipment other than the kind of light arms and some technical equipment that you actually see them roaming around with. So I don't think they'll actually be able to use some of the most sophisticated weaponry. But who's to say? Maybe there are, just as countries have technical advisors from third countries, that they may have technical advice. They may be able to provide them the training, the technical training to be able to use that in the coming days. So I think all this is possible. I think the Pakistanis would also be just wary, just as the Americans were, that these equipment could fall into hands that are actually opposed to them, and therefore also keep some control. So it's quite likely that they might keep them, bottled up, or it's quite likely. I mean, it's not happened before. It's quite possible that they might even smuggle them across to Pakistan. We have heard of many other things being smuggled from Afghanistan to Pakistan, so why not weapon systems as well? Some of the equipment I heard has also been parked in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. I think they will probably hold on to them, and in case they actually part with it, they will be very loaded political signals of accepting the Taliban. But yeah, short answer to your question is I don't see them being able to use this modern technology in the immediate. I don't think they can just get onto a helicopter, a Black Hawk, and fly. And of course, a lot of the equipment that was American owned was both taken away and destroyed. So I'm not so sure how much American equipment that was not handed over to the NDSF survives. And frankly, the numbers that I have seen are not very large. And in fact, they actually show how ill-equipped the ANA was during this period. At least that's my reading. You may have a better sense of that. But can I also come back to your last point about the Pakistani role? One of the most startling things, and I think the big problems that India has, is that successive American presidents have known that this war is actually being fought from Pakistan. You had Bush sending Armitage, telling President Musharraf, that we will bomb you into the Stone Age unless you cooperate with us on the Taliban. Of course, Musharraf did a U-turn and then did a U-turn again. Then you had Obama, who finally realized, it was in his campaign trail that he said, Iraq was a war of choice, Afghanistan is a war of necessity. In Afghanistan, the theater of the war is Afghanistan, but the locus of the war is Pakistan. And that's how he came up with, Holbrooke's mandate for AFPAC. Of course, then some countries, including, I'm sorry to say, the Brits, got in and confused the picture and confused the Americans into thinking that it's not only AFPAC. In fact, we have to bring in India. There's a third country involved, and confuse the issue. But Trump again also spoke of the South Asia strategy, where he directly nailed the Pakistanis as responsible for the problem in Afghanistan. I think Biden is the only person who hasn't publicly, identified Afghanistan as the problem. So the West has always known this. Their generals have known this. Their defense secretaries, Leon Panetta, called the Haqqani network a veritable extension of the ISI. They've all known this, but none of them have been able to follow up the logic of this and actually target Pakistan in terms of coercive diplomacy or sanctions or anything else, but to be able to discipline and control Pakistan's behavior. And then we are left as the only people talking about this, and then it gets reduced to an India-Pakistan issue. So I think this is a problem that we have, and we are going to see it now. The West is in a hurry to see a fig leaf to be able to recognize the Taliban. And when it does that, once again, we are likely to be about the only country that, remains a little bit of an outlier.
That's true, Ambassador. And in any case, Pakistan seems to be a clear winner here right now in this situation. And while the Americans can go back to the US and the Europeans can go back to Europe, India has to continue to live in this region and with completely cut out of Afghanistan. On the military equipment part, one interesting, fact or factoid I picked up was that the black market of M16 guns, the prices have just fallen down in Pakistan heavily. They've come down by more than 50% because the ANDSF has handed over their weapons to Taliban, and Taliban are selling them in Pakistan, and the prices have crashed in the black market. But moving away from the military, Ambassador, did India see it coming? Was all this inevitable, the way Indians have been completely cut out and virtually had to really find their way, and still do not know how whatever the few thousand Indians who are still left in Afghanistan, how will they get out of Afghanistan? Could things have been done differently so that India would still have some leverage in Afghanistan, would still continue to be able to do much more than what it seems to be completely cut out of Afghanistan now. India seems to be the big loser in Afghanistan, if I may put it harshly. Could it have done something differently?
Okay, I'll have to tackle this at several levels. I would be wary of sort of reducing this to an India-Pakistan thing, because we should never let the West forget that the problem originated with the US-Soviet rivalry, with this US, in some ways, US luring the Soviets into Afghanistan. And all along, a kind of superpower rivalry has been there on the top. It was initially US-Soviet, but in the latter period, it's also been US-Russia, and now increasingly US-China. And it was this overall superpower rivalry that gave Pakistan the opportunity to make itself not only relevant, but indispensable to the United States in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. So I think this should never be forgotten, that it is primarily an Pakistani project against Afghanistan, and a Pakistani project against much of the rest of the world. I think this point we should not lose off at all. If we think of in terms of losers, it is not only India. If we see the alignment over the last 20 years, what you had was a kind of post-Taliban, let's call it a democratic Afghanistan, supported by the United States, militarily supported by the United States and NATO. In other words, by the West in general, by Europe in particular, and by the democratic world, including India. That was the alignment. And today, with the takeover of the Taliban and the impending takeover, and I'll come to the question of whether we were prepared or not, what we have is a complete overturning of the alignment. What we now have is a kind of obscurantist, outfit in Afghanistan, supported by Pakistan, reinforced by China, and again, in terms of the overall alignment, Russia as well as Iran, both against the United States, in that order. So the loss is of the entire, what you can call the effectively democratic world, and the gain is of all those who, have a different agenda in Afghanistan. So that is there. Of course, India has the most to lose because India had the closest of all historical as well as economic ties with Afghanistan. So that is one. Whether we could have seen it, I think the message was on the wall. I think the government also knew it, that once the Americans decided to withdraw, once the Americans opened channels with the Taliban, once they agreed on the US-Taliban deal, separating the political settlement from the US-Taliban deal, the Afghan element from the US-Taliban element, and the decks were stacked both on the negotiating table and the battlefield, totally against the Afghan government and the Afghan security forces, and totally in favor of the Taliban. In fact, I actually wrote about this in a chapter in Pakistan Insights on the peace process, that effectively the United States has intentionally and consciously handed over Afghanistan to the Taliban and Pakistan. So I think the fact of a military takeover or a Taliban takeover, whether it was through a political settlement or through the battlefield, I think everyone knew. What surely surprised everyone was the speed of the execution, the strategy of the execution, very sophisticated strategy of the execution, the psychological war that was behind it, collapse of the Afghan army. Even though nobody had any hope in the Afghan government, there was some hope that the Afghan army, at least some of the generals of the Afghan army, there was hope that some of the jihadi leaders, there was also hope that there would be public resistance. And that hasn't happened. And I think that requires both introspection and analysis. And again, the signs were there. One of the signs was fatigue. And part of the strategy of the Pakistanis in Afghanistan was to wear down resistance. Remember, they had been fighting 40 years. People were tired. People felt fatigued. There were enough people who were saying, enough of it. Let's just have peace. The other day there was a a media event in which there was an Afghan lady who was speaking, and she was Hindi speaking. She was speaking Hindi, and she said, there are two things important for us: freedom and peace. And what they have settled for, all the Afghans at this moment when they have given up fighting, is they have just settled for a kind of resigned, defeated peace. But they haven't lost the urge and desire for freedom. So I think we have to wait to see what is going to be the outcome of that. This is just a beginning of a new chapter. This is not the end of the story. The Taliban are not going to rule happily forever and after. There will be political dynamics, there will be military dynamics, there will be geopolitical dynamics that will come into play. And I think it's too early to really forecast everything. But if you turn to what could be happening in terms of geopolitics, we could discuss some of the geopolitical aspects. If you turn to the issue of resistance, we could discuss that also a little further.
Ambassador, what really can India do now? I understand that the cards were stacked against the Indians. There were problems galore because of the way the West was tired of it, the way the Afghan society's own weaknesses, Pakistan's perfidy, Pakistan military's role. But what really are India's options diplomatically, so to speak, militarily, or otherwise? What can it do to have a better uh, outcome, influence the situation in Afghanistan?
I think we have to adjust and recognize the reality. The Taliban will probably come into power. They have already taken over by forced military. Most probably, Pakistan as well as some Afghan leaders will cobble together some kind of transitional government with the Taliban, which will give the takeover a bit of a political fig leaf, and therefore it will be very difficult to oppose that. Effectively, a lot of ethnic leaders will be accommodated, they will be given positions, but real power will remain entirely with the Taliban and their backers. I think for the time being, in my personal view, India has to adjust with two realities. One is that do we want to go back to 96 and simply sever all ties with Afghanistan and therefore actually get disconnected? Especially bearing in mind that part of the Pakistan strategy is to actually sever Afghanistan's relations with India and sever Pashtun relations with India. Remember, the Pashtuns played a very major part, though not the only part, in Afghanistan's traditional relationship with India. The Pashtuns, their historical, cultural, trade, economic, even political ties, if you think of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and others, lay with India, not with Iran or Central Asian Turkic speaking peoples, with whom actually they were in competition and rivalry. So I think my decision would be that we should maintain a level of engagement that allows people-to-people relations between India and Afghanistan. That means we should be able to continue our flights. We should be able to continue giving visas. We should be able to continue having medical patients. We should continue to be offering scholarships to Afghan students. They need not be necessarily approved by the Afghan government. They can be anyone. They can even be from third countries. We should definitely allow relocation of think tanks, of academics, of scholars, of media organizations. Women's organizations will need a place to stay. So civil society activism in general. We should keep alive the alternative of a progressive Afghanistan, even before and necessarily going on to a phase of resistance or a question of supporting the resistance. Those people who've been abandoned by the latest turn of, they should have an address where they can turn to as and when. So I would say that we would need, and this has to be negotiated what level it is, whether it should be at the level of a liaison office or an interest section or a charge, or whether we actually need to go ahead to a kind of diplomatic recognition. I think these are things that I think we need to be looked at more closely. But I would say that it should be short of, certainly short of anything like a full diplomatic recognition, at least partly because a lot of Afghan people will feel betrayed by that, partly because of the kind of record that they have had. I don't think that should be condoned. I think, on the contrary, the atrocities that they have committed, which can be compared with the ISIS in Iraq and in Syria, should be kept alive. In Myanmar, for example, the activists are documenting every single excess of the military regime. I think each one of the Taliban terrorist excesses should also be documented. I don't think these should be forgotten. And we will have to learn, if necessarily, just as Pakistan had diplomatic ties with the Afghan government, but at the same time supported the Taliban, maybe we will also need to have a kind of a policy that allows us to work with at some level of working with the Taliban, also always contingent on their behavior, but while continuing to support the Afghan people who support progressive values. How we do this, what is the kind of messaging that we do for this, we'll have to see. But I don't think the Afghan people would like to be abandoned by India in one form or the other, and we should be able to preserve that.
Ambassador, you spoke about the 1990s and how India should not make a mistake repeat the mistakes of the 1990s. But in the 1990s, China was still a much smaller player, not really a big player in Afghanistan particularly, and Russia and India were on the same page. Now Russia and China are on a different page, and they seem to be batting for Taliban. Even if in slightly subdued voices, and they seem more and more aligned with Pakistan in that sense. What can India do diplomatically then in this kind of a scenario where all the powers in the region seem to be aligned against Indian interests?
No, I think this is actually the crux of the issue. But let me just clarify my point on the 1990s. I'm not trying to say that we should not have done that. I think there were certain realities then. We did it. But what we face right now is that there is actually a Pakistani strategy for which they use the term geoeconomics, which is just another term for strategic depth, which is to actually reorient, in a way geopolitically and geoeconomically, reorient Afghanistan away from its traditional moorings to India, which to some extent they have cut to a great extent, or they have suppressed to a great extent, and reorient it towards Central Asia. And now, as you say yourself, they have partnered, or they have co-opted China into this endeavor. And oddly enough, even the United States seems to have fallen for it, although I don't think it's a very serious initiative, by talking about the Central Asian, South Asian connectivity quad, where South Asia basically begins and ends with Pakistan. And effectively, they will be connecting Central Asia to the BRI, Chinese CPC projects and routes in Afghanistan. So I think this is the context in which we have to see, okay, do we want to sever ties entirely and then just allow them to execute their plan, which is to sever or cut off links between Afghanistan and India even more than it has been done so far? Or do we remain in play? Of course, there will be the question how much Pakistan will interfere in this. But this is where I think we need to engage various parties. For example, Russia. Russia right now is feeling vindicated. I think they've got their revenge, or they've avenged their humiliation in 1989. But I think it's an open question whether the Taliban will be able to keep the ISIS or the IMU or the Hizb ut-Tahrir or even the ETIM under their control. Because after all, all this time, ISIS partly, but the others have been part and parcel of the Taliban kind of offensive in Afghanistan, even in this latest offensive. So I don't think they will be able to completely separate as well as suppress those ties. And sooner or later, the Russians are going to feel the bite of these extremist radical outfits in Central Asia. When it does, it may begin a rethink. I'm not counting on it, but I think it may begin a rethink. Maybe Russia is also counting on China to somehow keep it under control, and China has had remarkable success within China in keeping restive populations down. Maybe the Russians are counting on it, but I don't think we can totally, take that for granted. So yes, but we can. But we would have an interest with China to work against all kinds of extremist outfits. China is interested in ETIM. So at least there is, and they have also talked about being against an extremist dispensation in Kabul. They have wanted a moderate Muslim thing. Every now and then they have problems with the Pakistan, whether it was about the Dasu engineers or the attacks in Quetta a few weeks back. So I think we need to be a little supple in this, and we need to not assume that we have lost everything. And we need to also understand that it is still an evolving situation. What you have had is a cataclysmic event, but its repercussions are still to play out. So I would say yes, we are net losers, 100% net losers, but the game, will continue, and we need to see what we can leverage. Maybe, who knows? Suppose there is another major terrorist attack. Once again, there is a will to reassert themselves in Afghanistan. The cycle may turn back, change. Once again, I'm not counting on this, but I think it's it's not finished. It's an open story still.
Yeah, another aspect of it, Ambassador, the story is clearly not over. Another aspect of it is the public perception. At least I do not know how the government is looking at it, about the reliability of the United States as a partner, and particularly, there's so much of conversation around the Quad and the anti-China, kind of if not an alliance, a partnership that would be built around India-US relationship. Has it been damaged to some extent by the way the Americans have behaved in Afghanistan, or will Indians take it in their stride because there are few options that India has vis-a-vis China?
This is a very interesting question, Sushant. Let me take a couple of minutes on this. Of course, our relations with the United States are not limited to Afghanistan. They are much bigger, they're much broader. The Quad, the Indo-Pacific is an aspect of it. And of course, people will rationalize that, Afghanistan is not the beginning and end of our relationships, and certainly our relationship with the US. Uh, but I'm actually struck that in many ways the United States is not necessarily taking into board our sensitivities and interests in Afghanistan. If you saw my piece in the Express a few days back, I speculated that one of the objectives behind the US withdrawal is to let the Taliban come back in Afghanistan and become a problem for its strategic rivals, particularly China and Russia, but also Iran, for which in these 20 years period they were actually providing net security. So China too, in its own way, under pressure from the Quad, if you look at the kind of probing sort of moves it has made in the Pamirs and in the Karakorams and in the Ladakh range, and towards Afghanistan, soft diplomacy at this stage, but also dangling the carrot of a China-Pakistan relationship and RI and so on. That I think China also is positioning itself to puncture the mountains of Central Asia, to, in a way, find an outlet from the pressure of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific to reach out to Iran and the Persian Gulf for its energy interests. And part of that outreach is its 400 billion 25-year geo-economic deal with Iran, of which also has strategic overtones. But in the process, effectively, if they are actually setting the Taliban onto its strategic rivals, India, Democratic Afghanistan, the Central Asian republics, we are all collateral damage. And it doesn't seem as though the United States is bothered about that. So I would look, there are three things in this. Firstly, I think the US withdrawal at the end of 40 years, effectively giving victory at the end of the war on terror to a terrorist outfit, which has been not designated by it, but at least by the United Nations as a terror outfit. At the end of it, tells its own story. This will give a big boost to to all the terrorist and radical extremist organizations that have been on the back foot since the war on terror, including Al Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, as well as Iraq and Khorasan, and of course they have their agenda in Hind also. So effectively, they will actually give a boost to terrorism. That's one. That is kind of a boomerang effect that this is going to have. Secondly, I think U.S. leadership. When the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, one of the reasons why Najib could not hold on was, of course, they pulled the plug on funding, but it was also the collapse of the Soviet Union. Failure of leadership right now. Maybe we do not have a collapse of the United States, but the political signals that will go out from the failure of that kind of net security to its allies in Central Asia will be heard quite widely. Of course, I don't think. I mean, US has its own priorities. I don't think East Asia or Southeast Asia will be affected by it. But US leadership will suffer a blow, and one must wonder whether such a destabilizing agenda is part of a flailing, declining power. It is not a stabilizing agenda; it's actually a destabilizing agenda.
Ambassador, last question to you, and a quick question. What does the future hold for an optimistic Ambassador Mukhopadhaya and for a pessimistic Ambassador Mukhopadhaya?
Good question. Optimistic scenario is that the Taliban actually change their spots. That Taliban 2.0 is not Taliban 1.0. That they accommodate some of the gains of the last 20 years for the Afghans, some of the progressive principles of the Islamic Republic, and to a certain extent permit a degree of coexistence. How such a coexistence will be possible under the rubric of an emirate, I don't know. But also in terms of its regional and international relations, that they are not held hostage by any one country, whether it is Pakistan or China, that the normal Pashtun reflex of wanting good relations with India will remain, that the Pashtun trading relationship with India will be an incentive to moderate their behavior towards India, that they will actually show once they are out of Pakistan the kind of autonomy and independence that a lot of us have kind of hoped for from the Taliban. So that is the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is that the true nature will come out, that the true nature is what we have seen in the last 6 months, that essentially it will be a repressive, restrictive regime that will continue to suppress the rights of the Afghan people, that there may be schisms and frictions and factions within the Taliban, that just like the Mujahideen broke down into internecine, intra-Mujahideen fighting, we may have a multi-cornered civil conflict, one between those who are against the Taliban and the emirate and those who are for it, and then within that all manner of outfits, including possibly ISIS, ISIS-Taliban differences. We also have the TTP that could be emboldened. Very interestingly, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement in Pakistan has been totally opposed to the Taliban takeover. They have in fact expressed support for President Ghani and others who stand for the republic. So I think the pessimistic scenario is a turmoil that is even worse than what we saw during the Taliban period, because there are many more and many more radical and many more outfits that will not be able to get along with each other. And in that case, we have a Syria-like or a Somalia-like situation that would be like the worst case scenario. In the middle, I think we have to keep the option open that maybe China, with its economic heft and muscular diplomacy, might be able to bring some level of stabilization and peace in Afghanistan. If it does, whether that will allow for a role for India, that's an open question, because as I said, I think Pakistan and China are together in this, riding piggyback on each other, essentially to exclude India from the Afghan cake. And that, I think, is really one of the big challenges that we will face. And that's why I do feel that we should keep our relationship with Afghanistan and the Pashtuns open in some form, whatever minimal form it's possible politically in the beginning, until we see good behavior. And if they are accommodative, then I think we can gradually elevate our relationship.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. As you said earlier, this is the story is still not over. These are the early days of the story, and after a major event has happened. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with India Speak Ambassador Mukhopadhaya. To all listeners, thank you for listening. For more information on our work, follow us on Twitter at CPR_India or log on to our website at www.cprindia.org.